Welcome to Deeper, a series of Thursday evening talks hosted by Abandoned Normal Devices. Each week, we speak to the commissioned artists of the festival to go deeper into the ways of thinking and working.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mariama. I'm the curator at Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool. And joining me today is Hakeem Adam and Maxwell Mutanda. So Hakeem and Maxwell have collaborated on a project for Abandoned Normal Devices Festival. The project is called One Fifth of the Earth's Surface, and the title refers to the amount of the Earth's surface that is covered by the Atlantic Ocean. The project is an online interactive landscape that acts as something between a map and a body, and it gives us a way of navigating and understanding the world around us. Hakeem's work is fixated on the fabrics of contemporary Ghanaian society and is exploring ways to unravel the threads that bind through storytelling. Maxwell is a pluridisciplinary artist and architect from Harare, whose architectural practice takes a social focus on design. So, Hakeem and Maxwell, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to hear more about the project and your collaboration and the conversations that you've had, as well as hearing a little bit more about the archives and how you've compiled and made use of that material. And then maybe we can learn a little bit about the learning that you've encountered along the way. So I thought that we could start by maybe talking about the project itself. So maybe if you both introduce the project from your own perspectives in terms of storytelling and design.
Max, do you want to start?
Gosh,
I'm
sure.
interested in hearing this too from your perspective.
Yeah.
It's going to be a learning lesson for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting for me coming from a spatial background, I'm really interested in space and place and its relationship with the human condition. So this project really looks at water, so at river courses and oceanic routes. And for me, it really thinks a lot about historic environments within um, the built and natural environment. And it really is a reflection on the dominion of man, particularly from a white male perspective, right? In this lens of, say, hydrocolonialism. Um, so really the movement of goods, people, and services across space and across time was one of the things that I hope to get out of this. Not necessarily as an understanding, because I don't think it's fair to you know to solve any problem with one piece of work, one piece of writing, but a reflection, a critical understanding of different moments in time, different places, and yeah, just trying to understand that for myself and for others was the goal. Hakeem.
For me, it was more a discourse on power. Like the whole project for me boils down to like having discourses around power and finding different manifestations of power, and then transposing them in how we try to understand the world. Like it was, I don't know, the main source is obviously the Atlantic, just because of its gigantic nature. But like in thinking about it, it became more connected to like different forms of power. Um, like we were looking at maps as instruments of power, and like the political power whoever had the map had over the world basically, and being able to create routes and pillage resources and move people around the world. So for me, yeah, I think that was, I don't know, that's what keeps driving me through the project. And as we keep like researching, I'm always interested in these moments of power, even if it has something to do with just a flag or the name of some town that has no relevance today or something like that. I'm interested in their moment and encounters with power and being able to just reflect that in a very idiosyncratic research method.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic introduction to the work. And maybe you could talk a little bit about like the collaboration element of how you work together and that conversation between the two of you. And then maybe also thinking about like what does that collaboration look like between yourselves, but also like the viewers or the users or the communities that you're interacting with.
Hmm. I mean, like we've always maintained that the work is about dialogue between our practices, basically. Like we have very related but somewhat divergent practices and focuses in the things we're trying to address. So for us, they sort of all kind of link back to the waterway. I think we were speaking very early about this concept of the umbilical cord, like this channel to feed something. And I think we the conversation just manifests as trying to digest these moments that as they come up, trying to like make sense of, I don't know, like why King George had all the maps, just trying to have a different perspective to the ways in which we access the information and the ways in which the information is presented to us, through which lens, who's handing it down. So yeah, it's always been like just trying to think through it and then trying to find ways of representing that thinking that's not always accessible, but leaving enough space that there's a collaboration on the end of the viewer as well. So we have a very not necessarily design focused approach, but we're very much interested in interaction, in a sense of doing the research, but also sharing the research. It has to be interactive.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, one of the things that's evident is the language of communication is very visual. So we do privilege the visual, and it's it's important to say that they are sonic elements, but it is thinking of, say, what does it mean to put something down on paper, or to map a region of the world. Who gets to map it? And then in that mapping, who gets to name it? So, for example, we're looking at the different seas of the Atlantic, and you see within that a change in the way, say, the English Channel is named. From one perspective, it's known as, I think, the German Sea, if I'm not mistaken, Hakeem.
Yeah.
And it's really understanding those also shifts in power, I suppose, right? And so, in the same way that we are in conversation with each other, we want to also be in conversation with the viewer in a way that is inclusive. And a way to think about that is to think about an artwork as being incomplete without the participation of the viewer. So also in the say a building is incomplete without a user occupying it. And there is, say, within a social shift of architecture, this acknowledgement that the design has to leave room for the user to complete it. And so that's some of the thoughts that came into our mind. So whether that's in interacting as one navigates through the website, just the idea of scrolling through a page in a way also creates this flow. So what is this dynamic through the site as well was something that we thought was important. And it shifts and changes. And sometimes it's very static. But for us, those were moments of communication and collaboration, and exploration for someone joining the conversation from outside.
I just wanted to go back to something that you just said, Hakeem, around the idea of the umbilical cord as a channel or as a way of kind of starving, but also as a way of maybe feeding, and how that relates to that metaphor of power, and obviously like the metaphor of water and the shifting of boundaries or borders, or how we even understand the role of the Atlantic in terms of, as Maxwell was saying, the movement of people or goods or people as goods. Like, what are your thoughts in the work around that shift of power? Like, what are those effects or factors that are working on that to move those positions of power, if you think they're movable?
I mean, it's interesting because like we looked at it in maybe two different ways. One was just trying to express the like nature's own exercise of power, and then the other was looking at how man enforces control over nature. So in the very early stages of the process or the project, we're researching the Manchester Canal, and that's like a fantastic like explanation for this whole concept of an umbilical cord, like the whole history of how it was built and how it literally like sucks wealth from one part of the country into another city, but also like how it's basically reshaped the whole north, is it northwest of the United Kingdom? I think
It is,
I
yeah.
don't remember, but the whole northwest basically.
Yeah.
But then again, you have to look at it a lot further, with Liverpool being the first port um, to set sail for which a slave ship set sail from. Liverpool was the first ever. So like you have to look before this, like why was Liverpool an important point on the Atlantic in the first place? And how did it come to amass this critical importance and then feeding the UK basically? I can't remember your question now.
Well, it was just around the idea of how does power shift hands and
Yeah.
if that's possible to achieve and kind of
Yeah, I
looking at
remember.
the idea
Yeah.
of
So yeah, so for us, like an instance like the Manchester Canal became like an interesting magnifying point where we could then like, you know, blow it up and say, okay, so this is how nature enforces its control over the land, and this is how man further takes advantage of the power of nature to exploit, basically. Yeah, Max, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to focus it, right? But also the way that this man-made canal also very much links to the extraction and exploitation of the so-called empire and the colonies, right? So it really becomes this 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 red line that joins these disparate people, disparate nations, the movement of cotton from the global south to the north, the industrialization of the north, and and the space it occupies, the way the space changes, all around these connected threads for us was quite exciting. You know, the water as this highway, in which you know, people normally don't link them together, but we really enjoyed that. I think Liverpool's an interesting site because, you know, you can go there and the buildings are very evocative in that they tell a story. You know, you can see depictions of slaves on the building, depictions of the wealth of the empire on the building, and it's almost this. It's, I wouldn't say hidden, but it's underneath underneath the city. They are these links that, in a way, have fed it, and really aided in the generation of wealth.
Mm. I think it's interesting to think about the ocean as being a highway because it obviously evokes like ideas or feelings of movement. But I think also one of the factors on that is also the factor of time as well. And there's something really curious about the ocean because it is so unknowable to us. It's so unexplored and unexplorable in that kind of sense. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how we understand the ocean in terms of going back in time, but also going kind of further or deeper into the ocean in terms of understanding it? So in terms of moving back in time, but also kind of physically diving deeper into the ocean.
It's a really interesting like way to frame the question, because I was thinking about it, and like now, I think now we're most dependent on the ocean, but we're less aware of that. Versus maybe like 100 years ago, you're like not so dependent on it, but extremely aware of its critical importance to you.
Mm.
So the ocean, I don't know, for us, like, I don't know, it came, thinking about the ocean, we had to refer a lot to literature and to poetry and to folklore, because I don't know, there's a lot that's captured about the mystery of the ocean inside of literature. And I think that was one interesting way of thinking about excavating the memory, or like trying to access the memory of the ocean, because we also had thoughts about the ocean being a very like a variable memory space. It consumes everything, but it reveals nothing. Like, you know, it just takes, and, you know, what it reveals, it decides to reveal, but you then have to experience it to get something from it. So yeah, for us, I think the concept of our relationship with the ocean was mainly about memory, basically. Like, how do we try to understand this memory? How do we extract this memory? Are we allowed to extract this memory? And even what does this memory mean? Like, I don't know, there were a lot of points in researching the ocean which led to a lot of anger, like finding out about things like the ownership of certain ports along the ocean, or like why certain routes are mapped a certain way. Like, all of these things are, you know, they're emotions you have, but you do not know unless you're able to access the memory associated with them. So for us, it was like a really interesting way of unearthing, maybe.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the emotions as well? Because something that you said before was that there is an element of power that comes from being able to name something. So there must be an element of power in being able to name your emotions as well when you're doing this research, when
Yeah.
you're uncovering things. Like, what
No,
was that range? Like, what were the emotions?
I mean, like I said, it was an exercise in power, basically. And
Mm,
like this project, in as much as this research, is also like trying to enforce like our experiences on the conversation around power in the Atlantic, because I don't think, it's very rare that you have this very deep reflection on the construction of power from this perspective. It's usually from a Eurocentric perspective. So I think that alone was a really what's the right word for the emotion, but a really like intense thing to do.
Mm.
And I think that sort of translated throughout the project. There were parts where we're very, very strong in our voices, and there were parts where we allowed for having somber reflective moments where people could
mm,
decide what these emotions were. But yeah, some parts are very angry, very clearly angry.
mm.
There was
Yeah.
the handkerchief. We found a cotton handkerchief from the Royal Maritime Museum, and like yeah, like the description is like the most heartbreaking thing you can read, and like, you know, that is a piece of history you know you're never going to see, if I don't know for what reason you go searching into the archive to find it. So, you know, like,
Mm.
it made sense to translate that anger in that moment of
Can you tell
encountering
us
this
what the
object.
handkerchief, can you tell us what it said?
I read it out. But the handkerchief, it's a handkerchief of a scene describing colonialism, basically, and it
Okay.
talks about so there's a group of British soldiers rescuing supposed slaves, um, but the picture just shows people with guns pointing at people. It doesn't tell you they are being rescued or anything, and it alludes to how, you know, the empire benefited from um, slavery, basically. But it was just like such a grotesque and very just like nasty image, and the description was even more confusing. Like, I don't know how white people with guns are rescuing slaves in the 18th
Mm.
century. That's not how it works. So it's just like yeah, it was just
Yeah.
one of those moments where it was
I mean,
just
I've dropped it in for you, Hakeem, if
Yeah,
you
I
yeah.
want
just
to
saw.
pick it up. But yeah, so it was like the perversion of language in a way, as Hakeem said. The fact that African men, women, and children who are subsequently going to be shipped across the Atlantic are being described as being rescued. And, you know, the relationship of the people, and particularly in this object and image, the goods being rum. So it really comes together, this idea of people as goods, the goods that people mm, manufacture, and the relationship with empire in one image. And Hakeem really put an emphasis on, I think, the last sentence for me, if you found it.
I didn't see it. Hold on.
Well, while we're having a look at that, I think something else that I was really curious about was the use of the archives in themselves. So, how do you take over an archive? How do you share ownership? How do you reinterpret that from different perspectives? And I think one of the ways that I started thinking about it just recently was that the ocean in itself is acting as an archive. The Atlantic Ocean, we know, is essentially a very large cemetery where people have perished and people have died. And there are endless personal stories that have been lost along the way. So when it comes to working with archives, how do we activate them? How are they enlivened? And I guess I'm just curious to know like what your relationship is with those archives and how you work with them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'll be honest in that uh, some of it is quite easy to do. Say, for example, looking at a map, because you can look at a map and you can question a historic map with, say, a present map or the changes of a map. But then, say, with some of the audio archives or some of the objects, say, for example, one for me that was interesting was I think they're called sugar uh, pinchers. Am I saying that right? Sugar nippers. You know, this just an idea of what it means for someone to be able to put sugar in that tea in a terraced home in Liverpool, or London or York. It really connects you to India, to the Caribbean Antilles, and again, obviously, to the continent of Africa. And so, in what may seem like just an innocuous object of industrialization, you know, these metal tongs really speaks to the zenith of power and dominion over people and territories. And so it was, how do you treat that, not as an object of beauty, but an object of understanding? And how do you relate that archive with another archive that may not be as easily accessible? So accessibility to archives was something that was something we tried to question. And also, what is archived? Was something that came about. So there's a lot that maybe we couldn't find because it wasn't considered worthy of keeping or of recording. And so that was an interesting conversation with the archives as well that we personally enjoyed. Hakeem, if you want to add.
Yeah, on archive. I mean, for me, it was pure fun, honestly. Just because, like, we get to almost deconstruct this concept of what an archive is, which, on a very basic level, is just a repository of knowledge. You know, it's just like knowledge and connections. That's basically what an archive is. And we came in contact with many things referring to themselves as archives that had very different principles around knowledge and sharing the knowledge. So for us, it was like an interesting challenge to sort of say, okay, so this is the structure, that is the archive. How do we access what we want from it? And I mean, it led us to think in a different way, maybe away from just objects basically, but more about the stories behind the archives. I remember there was one, Max, I think you would remember the name, where we had found a bunch of maps and objects and photographs that we wanted to use, but just going on the journey of trying to figure out who owned all of these objects and why they had them. And it was a private collector, and the whole politics of that was just extremely interesting. Why is a private individual having such
I mean,
weird
I do
objects?
remember, but I'm not going to say. I'm not going to put them on blast. But yeah, I mean, so I think within many collections, you find works that have been either loaned or bequeathed to an institution. And so it's, who is this person? How are they able to then, share this knowledge,
And
right?
profit.
Exactly. And sometimes a lot of these objects are in contention. Um, and, what is the provenance of it comes into question. And so, yeah, it was fun. But I mean, I think for me, it got very interesting as it became more and more personal.
Mm.
I enjoyed this kind of look into, say, the personal. I really enjoyed the histories that maybe came out of, say, Grace Nichols has this great poem, um, which Outward from Hull, and I love that because she speaks to this idea of this. Just to quote an estuary leaving behind the forceful ghost of Wilberforce. And it's really thinking about constructing an archive, not just of fact, but also of fictions. What are the, these imaginaries that our histories are made out of? Because they really are. They are constructs in a way, right? Empire itself is a construct. We can't just treat it as a given because it really was the power of imagination that ruled over people. So, like merging the fact and the fiction, creating our own fictions as well, was a great way of thinking about archives. Um, Really grateful for the collaborators that we had from the British Library, especially because there was a real understanding there of what it means to have these objects. A lot of objects are hidden away and
Mm.
aren't accessible or are purposefully not even on view. Mm, and so that became a real big part of the work for us. And trying not to be didactic about it was part of the plan as well, because it's you don't want to replicate then these tropes.
Yeah, I think imagination is a really crucial word when we're talking about archives because they are fictions or they're fictitious. They are unreliable in the sense that they're based on one or a collection of people's narratives based from a certain bias or a perspective or an agenda. And how do we learn to see that bias and what do we do with that bias when we're working with archives or collections or materials? Is that something that you had to deal with when you were working with this material?
Yeah, it's exactly that. I think one of the things is, I think for us, the project, it almost manifests as this Wunderkabinet, right? Where there isn't this superimposed hierarchy, as you've mentioned, which in a way is a fictitious construct.
Hmm.
Um, and so that was something that I think maybe came through unexpectedly for me. Um, it was just this idea of putting things um, almost in a collage, right? Um, in a way that one can then unpeel different aspects of it. But yeah, I think also trying not to create new distinctions was a big worry for us. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Hakeem.
Yeah, no, I think you're like exactly right. I think we try to address bias and being very open in the discourse. Of course, we have like umbrella focuses for like certain themes that are quite obvious. But I think we try to, as much as possible, and this is kind of baked into the idea of having an archive of the website, which is a page to reference all the different research that is not only part of the work but inform the work. Just like exposing it. So I think for us, it was more about not being explicit, but trying to like just prompt you, like, like there's just something about the way in which information is presented, like most archives have like really precise dating and like, precise ordering and stuff like that. That forces you to think that the information is, credible because of the way it's been formatted. But for us, it's not about that. It's about the relationships, So I think that was our way of trying to, say that this is fictioning, but it's not fictioning just for fictioning's sake, but we're trying to prompt you to look at the information differently and not just see it as just because it's a website it's supposed to be true, or just because it's like bold, it's like important.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
maybe.
and also, sorry,
Oh no,
I
please
think
go ahead.
thinking also water was very important to the project, and thinking about how for us, the move to making this project digital was really thinking about this information as water, trying to have it flow, right? And be in a way unencumbered and at times find its own level. And so that was a good way of also thinking about it, to imagine the fluidity of knowledge, and trying not to make anything too static.
Mm. Yeah, I think like obviously water has the ability to displace things. So I guess when you're thinking about archives or how you share or like give a hierarchy to knowledge or information, some things will be moved out by others. And I think
Mm.
that's maybe like a really nice way of thinking about it. But maybe we could talk a little bit more about the website itself as well. So when we're talking about organizing information or we're talking about technology and power and accessibility. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've put the website together and how it flows or how it kind of responds to people looking at it and using it.
um the question of the website. um Yeah, no, I have to preface it by just like painting this picture for you, I think most people have an understanding of art or information as being like always having inherent order, which is sometimes true. But for us in doing this research around a singular subject, like we found that the order is always shifting. There was no one, there really wasn't one specific way of thinking about the Atlantic. There are numerous divergent ways, and we try to not put this all in your face, but give you the space to experience it in this way. I don't know, for us, a lot of the references we had and a lot of the things we were thinking about were always about allowing you and not like telling you what to do. So that played a big part in making the website very, very open-ended, I would say, and forcing the user to basically interact with it to figure it out, and not like having like a hamburger menu where everything drops down and you can find everything, or like not putting like back buttons in certain places, or having like some inter chapteral links just for you to jump through different things in different ways. So for us, it was really, just trying to make you understand that the knowledge about the Atlantic is not ordered, it's chaos. And we're trying to narrate that chaos, basically.
Yeah. That being said, there are some basic key framings, right? You you do have a homepage, but even in that, it's an exploration of deciding your own path. So you arrive, there are some prompts as to what the functionality is. The cursor as well gives you a hint at at what you can get from navigating over an object, or clicking on an object. Um, but yes, it does still have possibility within it. So there's a general landing site that, in a way, hopefully allows you to get to what became for us these five distinct um, chapters, in a way, that looked at cartography, navigation, rivers, ports, and memory. So they're clearly distinguished, but also they do bleed into each other in a way. Looking at one tells you something about another, and completes the picture. Uh, and seeing these 5 different chapters as moments for sculptural interventions. So the digital sculptures of one are completed by another, or are in opposition to another sculpture from a different chapter. But it really is in the whole that it comes together. But they are some distinct definitions that one has to do. But as Hakeem said, really trying to avoid the hamburger menu, right? And the sort of the conventional navigation of digital space in creating a digital flow,
Yeah,
hopefully.
yeah. And also like having like this like hybrid almost, where we're looking at the digital space as like a hybrid of the Atlantic, basically, which is like this massive wide open space for storing stuff and communicating stuff and moving stuff and moving power. So for us, it also became a challenge in trying to use web design to reflect that. And we're very lucky to have Oscar to help us out. Oscar is our web developer who helped us with the project. And yeah, it was also a really interesting process of having someone to discuss and also bring ideas about how like you can circumnavigate web design and make it work for you.
So maybe we could talk about like the fundamentals when it comes to the internet or having access to that, and thinking about data cables and how they're laid in the ocean on ocean beds. And I want to hear your thoughts around how those data cables, in a sense, form their own borders, or they form their own boundaries, and thinking about how they're laid and where they're laid, and if there's some kind of relation to physical or kind of geographical borders, and how that's kind of reinforcing the borders that we are living with today, while not necessarily being reflective or kind of fair to the people, or kind of going back to issues of access and things like that. Like, how does that inform your thinking, or does it inform your thinking?
Max, I'm going
Give
to
it a
mention
go.
the undersea
Yes,
cable map.
yeah, definitely,
Yeah,
definitely,
so
definitely.
I mean, as one does, if you're researching the ocean, we have our version of the submarine cable map of the world and all the landing points. And like it's a really interesting map. There's a point, I think, is the Cape Verde. I think I'm correct, where like the cables for Cape Verde just form a perfect loop around the island, and then all the other cables are going somewhere else. Like that alone just like shows you the like prominence of colonial power in the ocean. And like, so that means maybe the internet in Cape Verde is faster than maybe the internet in the Gambia, but like, because they're on different cables. And what does that mean for the economies of these two different places? What does it mean for their like, how are they able to share information or technology in the same frame if they're on different levels of access? So yeah, like the internet kind of grew from the Atlantic, so it made sense to have that reference to it inside of the project. And in regards to access, I mean, there's a myth of the openness of the internet, which I don't know, subliminally we wanted to talk about as well, because there's this myth that everything is on the internet and just Google, and like people always say that. It annoys me so much. It's just an
Yeah,
aside, but like,
I mean, there's a great quote by she's a professor at law in Uganda, Sylvia Tamale, who talks really about the technology companies as kind of reproducing colonial capitalism, right? And you see that. I mean, Facebook is owns a cable that they are constructing to bring faster internet to the African continent. They have dominion over this information, and that was something that was important to us, to really to again link the past with the present, and what this means for the future was something that we didn't want to pass by, to sort of say, the as you mentioned, the Atlantic as a place of lost souls, of buried bodies, and what do these buried cables mean within that story of uh, of extraction, and it really is it's now this extraction of information, that in a way people are quite less and less so is considered benign, but yeah, it really was a point for us as well
Yeah,
to touch on.
yeah. And also like I mean, in thinking about it in like the, I don't know, like everyone is aware of the fact that Africa is the place to be if you're into technology. Like it's just the masses, you know. So it's also like, why are all these cables pointing towards the continent? You know, it's like thinking about it in this way, but not making that statement of saying, okay, there's this huge portion of land and all these companies want to come there. For us, it's about you experiencing this and questioning why these constructions exist and trying to think about the knowledge on your own.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also interesting to think about the fulcrums. You know, these points that historically, like the Cape of Good Hope, or the different islands of the Atlantic, the Canaries, Cape Verde, etc., and in the Caribbean as well, Jamaica, still to this day become key within this term. You know, the cables have to go somewhere, and they, in a way, they follow in the paths of historic sailing ships or shipping containers. You know, it really is a reproduction uh, of capitalism that is very much a part of the story for us.
So, what are the legacies of these cables? We're dealing with the legacies of colonialism, and we're dealing with the
Mm.
legacies of cargo and goods and people and services being shipped on top of the ocean. What is the legacy in 10, 20, 50 years of these cables at the bottom of the ocean?
I mean, I think like personally, I think we're seeing it now. Like if you've been paying attention to the African continent over the past year, like there have been so many tiny, not tiny, but like little moments of change in opinion that's are facilitated by the internet. Like things like Facebook, like WhatsApp, like Twitter are just becoming like these large, massive machines, and they're going against governments. And I think that's like one of the legacies we're witnessing now. Like the political class had sort of assumed that barriers in education will always hold people back, but the internet is destroying that completely. People are inventing ways of surviving and protesting and making their voices heard. So I think that's like one of the, I don't know if it's a legacy because we're still experiencing it. And for me, it's hard to see like what comes outside of it. But we also know what that means. Like Twitter is moving to Ghana, Facebook is in Nigeria. Like, you know, they're there for money. So like, in as much as it's also empowering us, we're also aware of what it's bringing to us. So it's, I don't know, it's about like trying to think about all of these things while being excited about TikTok, thinking about like,
Mm.
what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's like they're like shackles of freedom, right? In as much as they've liberated communication, and there was, of course, this great digital leap in Africa, it is also very much subject to um, historic legacies. Um, I think, you know, Ghana, Zimbabwe, they've all experienced internet shutdowns in the face of overwhelming protest, um, and and the ownership of these cables then also becomes a reflection on who has dominion, where is the money coming from. You see, I don't know if you meant to say it as Orange because they're French, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these coalitions of ownership, um, and I mean they're mirrored. I think Hakeem, it reminds me also of the ports in
Yeah.
West Africa. If you want to talk
There's,
about the
there's
ownership of those.
16, so there are 16 West, is it 16 Yeah, so first of all, there are 15 countries in West Africa, like in ECOWAS, and then there are 16 ports, and all 16 are owned by one French company. And they also own like the railways and a lot of the road infrastructure to like bring the resources to the port. So for us, like, yeah, like the Facebook data ship or the Google data ship has to dock somewhere. Like that's also a conversation about power, and like we can't ignore that there's massive growth in digital literacy on the continent, but we have to also think about what about our data rights? Are people aware of where their data is going? Are governments, interested in, what content people are thinking about on Facebook? Are they recording all of that data? Like, we have to, I don't know, ask those questions, but we have to be confronted with information. And the funny thing about, or at least for me, what is funny about this is that all the information is out there is just very, very distilled to a point where you have to look at it through a certain lens to understand it. So for us, it became more about, just bearing it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. It's really well said. Because, I mean, even within, say, the production of art on the continent, there's this idea that a turn to the digital is almost, a given. It'll be the salvation. But what does that really mean? Who has access to it, and what is digital art for the continent in contrast to the Western market, and because these ideas of ownership and accessibility are inherent in the conversation and the legacies of the digital for us as well. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of quite heavy stuff, but it was really enjoyable for us, I think, nevertheless.
I just have maybe like one or two last questions, and they're around like the visual language of the work that you're interested in doing. So understanding, like getting an idea of what it is that people picture when they think about power or technology or the internet or archives, and just thinking, how do we unlearn or how do we reshape the eye that we're looking through? Like even the maps that we use today, they use the Mercator projection. We know, like, how can you map a 3D object on a 2D plane? It's not possible. There's always distortion in the things that we're looking at, whether we're aware of that or not. Is that something that you hold in mind when you're pulling these archives together, or when you're doing this research, or when you're collaborating with people? And what do you do about that?
Max, you do, or I can say, like Max just did. There's a part of the website where we're thinking about making statements on rivers, and Max did like these really amazing animations where he's like flying over different rivers, and um, I can't describe it. You have to see it to understand what it means to have that perspective. Because for us, it was more about like repositioning what the Niger Delta looks like. Like if you Google Niger Delta today, it doesn't look, it looks weird. But like when we present it in this way, we're not thinking about oil immediately. You're not thinking about violence. You're not thinking about Biafra. You're not thinking about civil war. You're not in that space. You're looking at an interesting form and you're wondering where it's from and stuff like that. So for us, perspective is how we, I don't know, create these invitations into wonder about the work, or like leaving these gaps where people can start to explore. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's like a quick example of like
Mm.
perspective and shifting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm so glad you brought up Makeda, because, I mean, for us, there's this great book by a researcher, I think he's at UPenn and slash Harvard, Dilip da Cunha, and he talks about the invention of rivers and how this boundary between the land and the sea is almost an artificial boundary, right? That we create. I thinking about how we see it, I like inverting the map a lot always. But I shared this idea of Stillhouse projection, which really focuses on the bodies of water as opposed to the land masses of the world. And for us, that was a way of looking at it. Everything for us was seen from the perspective of the Atlantic, and in a way, it sort of upends the conventional projection of how we see the world, and we enjoyed that.
And I just have one last question, and it's going back to that idea of power as well. And we've talked about power almost as if it's originating from someone else or it's being exerted on individuals or artists or creatives in that sense. But as practitioners, you are in a certain position of power. And I'm curious about how you feel about your social responsibility in dealing with that.
Yeah, I don't think it's lost on myself or Max that we're in great positions of power. Even being able to access like some of the archives is something that has not been lost on us. So for us, like I don't know, I think our way of reconciling this is with the archive page, which is where we're saying that's like we're aware of how difficult it is to like just find some of this information, and even how tedious of it is to even imagine that some of this information exists, because for us we didn't even know till we're presented with it. So for as a way of addressing, or at least I don't know, Max will say for himself, but as a way of me addressing my feeling of being empowered by information was to share it and to make it as transparent as possible.
Mm.
Um, but yes, it's interesting, and I think it's also important to mention that it's interesting to have these feelings of experiences of power, because it's part of the exercise of the work. Like the information is meant to, I don't want to use the word empower, but to empower people. You want them to read something and feel like, okay, there is some part of their heritage that is restored, or some part of their story that they can think about differently. So for me, it was also very, very important to use the power and not just, okay, I have the information and I forget about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Just being able to even just put the work together, to have the opportunity to do this is 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 in a way emblematic of being empowered. And yeah, it's not something that one can take lightly. And so it's making sure that you question absences. Um, you really look at the archive and say, well, um, what what's not there and why isn't it there, and what is there and why is it there as well, was important. Using that power to do something that may not readily be done before was a great opportunity for us, to sort of say, with this, what can we do that's never been done before? And I think there's a growing um, a group of people who really are addressing archives and institutions. I'm always looking to um, different people, especially in the United Kingdom. There's a professor at the Pitts River who does a lot on what is the role of the archive now, especially with regards to work that doesn't belong there. What does it mean to restitute work? But what does it also mean to 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 give back knowledge? Is something that was interesting. Because it's yeah, in as much as we grew up both in former colonies, um, the perspective from the African continent is very different. And so engaging with the archives in the United Kingdom, and that reflection, and the gap in translation. Hakeem does something which I really love when he speaks of the national flag as the Jack Union. It really upends a lot of hierarchies, and I think that's important. Um, and yeah, so that was hopefully how we try to relate to it, to
Mm.
to the power that we've been granted.
I think that is a perfect place to end things. You've given me so many ideas and topics to think about around ownership and power and collaboration in archives and just the position that we put ourselves in when we're looking at things and trying to remain aware of our own biases and things like that. So I think that is a fantastic place to end. But thank you both so much for your time. And this has been just a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for your questions. Like, there's a lot of stuff I don't know if we've thought about in this way, but yeah, thanks for bringing them up.
Absolutely.